November 18th, 1944. The Hürtgen Forest was hell on earth. A nightmare of shattered trees and frozen mud where entire companies vanished in minutes and the ground itself seemed to swallow men whole. 34-year-old Sergeant William Thomas crouched behind a fallen oak, his M1903A4 Springfield rifle steady in hands that had skinned deer and tracked bear through the Ozarks mountains long before he ever wore a uniform. The kid next to him, maybe 19 years old, was shaking so hard his teeth chattered, and Thomas could smell the fear coming off the boy like sweat. Through the scope, Thomas could see German soldiers moving between the trees about 300 yards out. Confident, relaxed, probably thinking the Americans were too beaten down to fight back. They were wrong. Thomas had been called too old for this war twice. Rejected by recruiters who took one look at his birth date and shook their heads like he was crazy for even trying. He was a backwoods hunter from Arkansas who'd never finished high school. A man who knew how to track animals through dense forest and make impossible shots from distances that would make most men give up. But the army didn't want him because 34 was ancient for an infantryman when most of the guys hitting the beaches were barely old enough to shave. Then December 7th, 1941 happened, and suddenly the rules changed because America needed every man who could carry a rifle. And Thomas walked into that recruiting office a third time with a look in his eyes that said he wasn't leaving without a uniform. They took him. And here's the thing, this story gets even more insane. So if you're enjoying this, smash that subscribe button because we tell stories like this every single week. What those German soldiers in the Hürtgen Forest didn't know was that the old man watching them through that scope was about to become the most feared sniper in the entire sector. A ghost who would kill 121 confirmed enemy soldiers in just 14 days and make hardened Wehrmacht veterans terrified to even show their faces during daylight. This is the story of how a hunter from Arkansas proved that age meant nothing when you had a lifetime of patience and the coldest nerve in the American Army. The Hürtgen Forest in November 1944 was where the US Army learned that winning a war wasn't always about tanks and planes and massive firepower. Because this was a different kind of hell where all that technology meant nothing and men died in the mud fighting for 50 yards of worthless ground. The forest was thick with pine and fir trees planted so close together that sunlight barely reached the forest floor, and when American artillery tried to blast through German positions, the shells exploded in the treetops and sent jagged wood splinters raining down like knives that killed anyone unlucky enough to be underneath. The Germans had been fortifying this place for months, building bunkers and pillboxes hidden so well you could walk past them without knowing they were there until machine gun fire cut you down. The 2nd Infantry Division, Thomas's unit, had already taken brutal casualties trying to push through, and morale was so low that some officers were quietly wondering if the whole operation was a massive mistake. Thomas had been assigned to division as a sniper not because of any special training. He'd barely qualified as a marksman in basic, but because his company commander had watched him shoot and realized this backwoods hunter could do things with a rifle that regular soldiers couldn't even imagine. Back in Arkansas, Thomas had grown up hunting to put food on the table during the Depression when missing a shot meant your family went hungry. And that kind of pressure teaches you things that military training never could. He knew how to wait, how to become part of the landscape, how to control his breathing and heartbeat so that when he finally squeezed the trigger it was like his body wasn't even there. Just the rifle and the target and nothing else. The Army gave him an M1903A4 Springfield with a scope, the same basic rifle American soldiers had carried in World War I but modified for precision work, and Thomas treated that weapon like it was an extension of his own body. The first German soldier Thomas killed in the Hürtgen Forest was an officer, and the shot itself wasn't particularly difficult by Thomas's standards. Maybe 250 yards through a small gap in the trees where the officer had gotten careless and stood in the open for just a few seconds too long. Thomas squeezed the trigger, felt the familiar kick against his shoulder, and watched through the scope as the officer dropped like someone had cut his strings. The Germans around him scattered, confused, not sure where the shot had come from because Thomas had fired from a position nobody expected, hidden in the branches of a tree where regular soldiers would never think to look. That was Thomas's edge, the thing that made him different from other snipers who learned their trade in some military school. He thought like a hunter, not a soldier, and hunters know that the best place to wait for prey is somewhere the prey never expects you to be. Word spread fast through the German lines that there was an American sniper operating in the sector. A ghost who could kill you from impossible distances and angles that shouldn't have been possible. German soldiers started moving differently, hunched over and scared, running between positions instead of walking, and officers stopped standing in the open or gathering in groups where one good shot could take out multiple targets. But Thomas adapted because that's what hunters do. He'd move positions constantly, never shooting from the same place twice, and he developed a sense for when German soldiers thought they were safe. Those moments when exhaustion or routine made them careless for just a few seconds. That's when Thomas would kill them, and the psychological impact was devastating because the Germans never knew when or where he'd strike next. The physical conditions in the Hürtgen Forest made Thomas's job both harder and easier in ways that seemed contradictory but made perfect sense if you understood how he operated. The forest was so dense that long-range shots were nearly impossible because trees blocked sight lines and made it hard to see more than a few hundred yards in any direction. But Thomas had grown up hunting in thick Ozark forests where you learned to find those small windows of opportunity. The gaps in the vegetation where you could thread a bullet through spaces that looked impossibly small. Rain fell constantly, turning the ground into a thick soup of mud that made movement exhausting and left everyone cold and miserable. But Thomas had spent his entire life hunting in bad weather because animals still needed to eat regardless of rain or snow, and he knew how to stay focused when other men were too cold and wet to think straight. The shattered trees from artillery created a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet, jagged stumps and fallen trunks everywhere. But to Thomas this was just terrain to be used, cover and concealment that a smart hunter could exploit in ways the enemy never expected. German soldiers in the sector started calling him the Old Man, a nickname born from fear and respect because survivors who'd seen their friends killed by his shots said the sniper had to be some veteran hunter, not a regular soldier. Someone who moved and thought differently. They were closer to the truth than they realized. Thomas was older than most American soldiers by a decade or more, and while that age meant his body couldn't run as fast or fight as hard in close combat, it also meant he had patience that younger men simply didn't possess. He could wait for hours without moving, watching a German position through his scope, breathing slowly and evenly, until finally someone made a mistake and gave him the shot he needed. Young snipers got impatient, took risky shots because they wanted action. But Thomas knew that hunting was 90% waiting and 10% execution, and the men who understood that balance were the ones who survived. Thomas's routine during those 14 days was brutal and relentless, and he operated with a discipline that amazed the officers who worked with him. He'd wake before dawn when the forest was still dark and the cold made his joints ache. Then move out alone to whatever position he'd scouted the day before, carrying his rifle and minimal gear because every extra pound slowed you down and made noise. He'd settle into position, often 50 or 75 yards ahead of American lines in what was essentially no man's land, and wait for targets. Sometimes he'd kill 3 or 4 Germans in a morning, quick methodical shots that dropped men before they even knew they were in danger. And then he'd relocate immediately because staying in one place after shooting was asking to die. He'd return to American lines for food and ammunition, file his report with the tally of confirmed kills, then head back out for the afternoon shift. Sleep was something that happened in short bursts between missions, never more than a few hours at a time, and the cumulative exhaustion should have broken him, but Thomas had spent years working 16-hour days on his family's farm and hunting from sunup to sundown. So this was just more of what he'd always known. The Germans tried everything to kill him, and the fact that they failed showed just how good Thomas really was. They sent their own snipers to hunt him, trained marksmen who were supposed to be the best the Wehrmacht had. But Thomas killed them too because he understood something they didn't. Hunting another hunter requires thinking like prey, not like a predator. German snipers looked for him in logical places, positions that offered good fields of fire and cover. But Thomas would set up in spots that seemed tactically stupid, places with limited sight lines or awkward shooting angles, and that unpredictability kept him alive. They fired artillery at areas where they thought he might be hiding, saturating whole sections of forest with high explosive shells that turned trees into splinters and earth into craters. But Thomas was already gone, moved to a new position before the first shells landed because he'd learned to recognize the signs that a bombardment was coming. They sent patrols to flush him out, squads of soldiers sweeping through the forest trying to find him. but Thomas could hear them coming from a quarter-mile away and would simply disappear deeper into the woods where they couldn't follow without getting hopelessly lost. The tally of kills mounted day after day, and by the end of the first week Thomas had killed over 60 confirmed Germans, a number that seemed impossible to officers who understood how difficult sniping really was. Each kill was logged and verified because the army needed proof, and Thomas's spotter, a young private from Pennsylvania who initially thought being paired with the old man was bad luck, confirmed every single shot and watched in amazement as Thomas made kills that shouldn't have been possible. 300-yard shots through gaps in trees barely wider than a man's shoulders, moving target shots on German soldiers running between positions. Even one incredible shot where Thomas hit a German machine gunner who was firing from a bunker slit that offered maybe 6 inches of exposed target. The spotter kept asking how Thomas could make these shots, and Thomas would just shrug and say it was the same as shooting squirrels back home. You just aimed for the small target and trusted your rifle. By the second week, the psychological pressure Thomas created was affecting German operations across the entire sector, and American intelligence officers monitoring enemy radio traffic reported that German units were specifically mentioning the sniper in their communications and requesting reinforcements or permission to withdraw from positions they considered too exposed. German soldiers were refusing to leave their bunkers during daylight, which meant they couldn't perform basic tasks like bringing up ammunition or food, and some units were so paralyzed by fear that they became combat ineffective without Thomas firing a single additional shot. This was the true power of a skilled sniper, the force multiplication where one man with a rifle could shut down entire enemy units and create chaos far beyond what the numbers suggested. American commanders started using Thomas as a psychological weapon, deliberately leaking information about the old man sniper to German prisoners during interrogations, knowing the stories would spread and make the fear even worse. The human cost of what Thomas was doing never really left him, and the spotter noticed that after particularly successful days when the kill count was high, Thomas would get quiet and distant, staring at nothing while cleaning his rifle with hands that moved on autopilot. Thomas never talked about whether he felt guilty or conflicted about the killing, because men of his generation didn't discuss feelings like that. But there were moments when the spotter saw something in the old man's eyes that suggested this wasn't easy despite how good he was at it. Each German soldier Thomas killed was someone's son or brother or father, and Thomas knew that better than most because he had kids back home in Arkansas who were probably old enough to be drafted themselves if this war kept going. But Thomas also knew that every German he killed was one less enemy soldier who might kill American boys, and that mathematics was simple and brutal and left no room for doubt about whether this work was necessary. On the 14th day, November 2nd, Thomas killed his 121st confirmed German soldier, a young officer who made the mistake of thinking the sniper wouldn't be active during a morning rainstorm when visibility was terrible and most soldiers were hunkered down trying to stay dry. Thomas was there because he knew that's exactly when men got careless, and he took the shot from almost 400 yards through rain that made his scope lens blur and made the calculations nearly impossible. The bullet hit center mass, and Thomas watched the officer fall, then packed up his rifle and headed back to American lines because something in him knew this was the end of something. He'd been operating at maximum intensity for 2 straight weeks, barely sleeping, barely eating, pushing his body and mind to limits that would have broken younger men, and he could feel the exhaustion finally catching up in ways that made his hands shake and his vision blur. The battalion commander wanted him to keep going, said the Germans were on the verge of breaking and Thomas could push them over the edge. But Thomas shook his head and said he needed rest or he'd make a mistake that would get him killed. They gave him 3 days off. William Thomas survived the Hürtgen Forest and the war, made it all the way through to VE Day and came home to Arkansas where he went back to hunting deer and raising his family like the previous years had been some kind of fever dream that happened to someone else. He never talked much about what he'd done, never sought attention or recognition, and when reporters occasionally tracked him down asking about the legendary old man sniper, Thomas would give short, polite answers and then make it clear the conversation was over. The army awarded him a Silver Star for his actions in the Hürtgen Forest, though Thomas always said the medal should have gone to his spotter who'd kept him alive by watching his back through 2 weeks of constant danger. He kept his rifle after the war, the same M1903A4 Springfield he'd used to kill those 121 Germans, and sometimes he'd take it out to the backyard and fire a few practice rounds just to keep his skills sharp. though he never explained why an old man who'd seen enough killing to last several lifetimes would want to maintain those particular skills. The Hürtgen Forest campaign ended up being one of the longest and bloodiest battles the U.S. Army fought in World War II, with over 30,000 American casualties for gains that were measured in yards rather than miles, and military historians still debate whether the whole operation was a strategic mistake that wasted lives for objectives that didn't matter. But for the men who fought there alongside William Thomas, there was no debate about whether his presence mattered, because they'd seen firsthand how one skilled soldier operating with precision and patience could change the tactical situation and save American lives by eliminating German threats before those threats could kill anyone. Thomas killed 121 enemy soldiers in 14 days using skills he'd learned hunting rabbits and deer in the Arkansas wilderness. And the fact that he did it at age 34 when the military had twice rejected him for being too old made the whole thing even more remarkable. Thanks for watching this story from the WW2 Vault about the old man sniper who proved that age was just a number when you had a lifetime of experience behind the trigger. Next week we're covering the tank commander who destroyed 17 German panzers in a single day using tactics nobody had ever seen before. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.